Hello, and welcome to another guide for Divinity at Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at the Icini, who are the representatives of Southern Britain in this mod, in this game. And they are pretty good at doing that. They have amongst the best skirmishers in the game, a diverse and interesting cavalry roster, and their infantry are unlike that of the other Celts because their best units are factional mercenaries, meaning that you can recruit them quite easily anywhere. However, the amount that you can have is significantly constrained compared to the other Celtic factions. This forces you to employ a lot more unique tactics and army building strategies as your very best units are restricted, meaning that you have to use your other tools as effectively as possible. I really like this faction. They have a very unique feel, they have a very interesting feel. They're not a particularly difficult faction to use, but at the same time they feel rewarding, even though the campaign itself isn't very difficult. So I highly recommend that you try this campaign out. But in any case, let's go look at the starting position for the Icini and figure out what best to do in the early game. Alright everybody, so when it comes to your early game as the Icini, you're honestly just going to have an easy time. The Icini turn 1 start position is not particularly difficult. In all of my tests, I was able to conquer the entirety of this initial province that you start with, Britannia that is, within like 10 turns. Before the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage started. And the reason why is because these factions don't particularly work well together. Rattay is 1 turn away from Camulodunum, regardless of whether it's winter or a better season for marching. Meaning that you can just take Rattay the moment that you're able to. The moment that you've consolidated enough strength to take Rattay, this is the first settlement that you should take. And it's really not that difficult too. Sure, you do start out at war with this faction over here, the Demete. However, they're like 3 or 4 turns marching from your capital here at Camulodunum. So you're going to see them going at your capital from like a mile away before they arrive, making it quite easy to just avoid being surprised by these guys. And as long as you just send a spy to go check them out, you should have a pretty easy time. But speaking of that, you really do need to recruit a spy. Initially to spy on Rattay, just to make sure that they're not cooking up an amazing army here, but afterwards to go spy on your rivals, the Nemete as well as the Demani. Now, when it comes to what you should do in early game, it's actually like pretty clear when it comes to the Icini. You take all of Britannia first, and then afterwards you take Caledonia and Hibernia at the top. Ultimately, there's no reason to go south towards the mainland because it's just way harder to compete here compared to in Britain, where in general, the factions around you won't make particularly strong armies in early game. It's just really easy to subdue them at the beginning of the campaign. Besides that, you are relatively safe from your enemies or your rivals on the mainland. Like, no one really hates you here. The Gauls are willing to trade with you. The Germans view you with suspicion, but not hostility, making it an ideal opportunity for you to just take all of the British Isles and make a really solid economy that will help fuel your expansionist efforts on the mainland against factions that are not nearly as wealthy, not nearly as consolidated, and you can very easily make an empire. In fact, to be completely honest, if you play this correctly and you quickly take the British Isles and then expand against, you know, your mainland European opposition that just won't have nearly as much money or financial security as you really shouldn't face any true test until you like meet up with the Romans somewhere in Northern Europe. And even then, they'll be far more overextended than you if you've expanded properly. So just in general, like making an empire as the Icini is quite easy. You have to understand how the start position works. And that has to do a lot with your recruitment. You see, your total on recruitment looks deceptively terrible here. Like amongst all of these few units that are on offer here, the only good one is really the Slinger. And it's not like Slingers win wars. Slingers don't win empires. They never have, right? But this is like a decent skirmish unit, you know. It makes sense to get like 4 of these in your initial army. Aside of that, you're stuck with terrible levies, unexceptional cavalry, a decent and cost-effective early game skirmisher, but nothing exceptional here in this javelin unit. Things like bleak. But what really does redeem this roster are your mercenary options. You see, Unlike most factions, the best of the Icini roster are available here as factional mercenaries. So the difference between regular mercenaries, which are dependent entirely on the region you're in, like in Greece you'll get hoplites, in Spain you'll get good cavalry and Balearic slingers, in Numidia you'll get Numidian cap, regional mercenaries. The difference between regional mercenaries and factional mercenaries is that factional mercenaries are available anywhere. Like, these units will slowly accumulate, like, say one noble sword here will become on offer next turn, and then you can recruit that noble sword in any province. You kind of have like a bank. But once you withdraw this one unit from the bank, it's no longer available anywhere. So you kind of accumulate these elite units as time goes on, and they honestly do accumulate pretty quickly. Like, every couple of turns, you'll get one of these, either a noble chariot, a noble swordsman, or a two-handed sword master. And all three of his units are great. They're all absolutely phenomenal units, and nothing around you is going to have similar units. Like, none of these factions have factional mercenaries that are elite like these. Meanwhile, the other mercenary options available in this province are honestly really good. Like, the Spearman is good as its own right. It has elite spear stats. The Scout Rider has pretty good combat stats, just low armor, but is very, very quick nonetheless. This sword unit, which I just recruited, is excellent. 28 weapon damage is near elite, and they have 225 men. Sure, they have low armor and their combat stats are just good but not great, but compared to the levies you're going to be facing elsewhere, because all of these factions will ultimately recruit a huge amount of levies and a slightly better levy spearmen that do come from the warrior class. Like, they're kind of mid-tier spears, but they're not good at all, guys. Like, British mid-tier spears are not particularly good, at least the ones that your opponents are going to recruit here. But compared to those units, these mercenaries will be elite. These guys will completely outclass your opponents. And honestly, just recruiting every mercenary other than the other than this chariot, like this particular chariot here is bad. Like, this chariot here, the one that comes from your factional mercenary pool, is good, but this one here is bad. But outside of this one, if you just recruit all of these, you'll quickly make an army that's just completely better than your opponents, but also you'll also deny your opponents from using these mercenaries, which will help beef up their armies. So as long as you do that, as well as just recruit your slingers, recruit maybe a couple of these levies just to kind of beef up your ranks, but, replace them with mercenaries as time goes on, you'll just be able to crush your local opposition and just quickly eviscerate all of these guys. I'm telling you, just go in like a strike of lightning and just wipe them all out. Afterwards, I would take the northern parts of the island. I would take on the Caledonians, the Brigantes, and the Hibernians here. Once you've conquered all of Britain, it'll be really easy to, because you'll just be way wealthier than everyone else. I mean, that's really it. When it comes to technology, I would just focus mostly on military technology at the beginning. Just getting this level 2 infantry building is so important, so you can actually start getting some of your mid-tier units. They aren't amazing, but at the very least, they are significantly better than your levies. At least it'll give you something stable to draw from. I would probably get this technology too. What is it? The upgraded chariots, or none of this one, so you can get horse pens and you can start getting cavalry, because the cavalry of the Icini is honestly pretty good. Your capital, I'd focus on food, because you might not get the opportunity to do a lot of food. I would destroy this building and build a temple instead, because there are some incredibly good temples for the Icini. They have some great temples that help boost charge bonus in general, so look out for that one. But other than that, it's pretty easy to manage Britannia. There is I believe a wonder over here, which is actually really, really strong. You're going to like that one. It's going to help boost your early game economy 100%, as well as your late game economy. It's not a building that ever goes out of fashion. But things are honestly quite straightforward when it comes to managing and conquering these two provinces. I would make Britannia your military province. I would make Caledonia just an economic province, just a nice agricultural province for you. And afterwards, you just have to decide where you're going to attack next. You're probably going to build up a navy at Camalodunum, a couple of units to ferry troops over. And afterwards, you just have to figure out if you're going to go to Gaul or if you're going to go to Germania. Personally, I'd favor going to Germania, because it doesn't matter which one of these cultures you conquer. If you're not going to have any cultural affinity with you, so just conquering foreigners. Even the Gauls were just so divergent from the Brits at this point that they're considered an entirely different people. Even though, they are more similar culturally to you historically. The game doesn't account for that, so ignore that. The most important thing, honestly, is just figuring out which, factions are kind of vulnerable, sending your spy in just to investigate. But also, I would personally conquer Germania. I just feel like it kind of helps you stay out of the way of the Romans for longer. And also, the Germans do tend to actually accumulate quite a bit of territory. They actually end up making empires, like the Lugian Suebi in particular, while the Gauls just never get rolling. Like, I've never seen a Gallic faction actually become a power faction in a Divide et Impera campaign. They almost always just get conquered and blitzed by other people. So I would just focus on the real threat, which are the Germans, and afterwards I'd go take out those pesky Gauls. So just kind of the order of operations for me. But that's all I have when it comes to campaign strategy, guys. Now let's go look at the buffs and debuffs for the faction, which are actually quite cool and important. And then afterwards, we can go ahead and look at the roster for Icini. Now, when it comes to the buffs and debuffs of Icini, you actually get some quite strong ones. In fact, in general, I would say that Icini have some of the best buffs in the game, because the debuff here isn't particularly important, and the buffs are very strong, making, in general, just all of these modifiers a humongous net positive for the Icini. The buffs make the faction stronger. The debuff can be pretty easily remedied just by having temples and stuff built up. So, in general, I really, really like the buffs and debuffs for this faction. But all of the Celts do generally get some pretty strong buffs up here. The cultural buffs for the Icini that all of the Celtic factions, all three of them in Divide et Impera get, are Fierce Independence, plus 10% melee defense for all units during defensive battles, which is honestly pretty dang good. Like, you're not going to play a ton or mostly defensive battles in, a Rome 2 campaign. I'd say you're mostly going to be on the offensive. But simultaneously, 10% melee defense is pretty strong. And if you find yourself in a somewhat desperate situation in the campaign, this could be pretty useful. Just fall back on your territory and suddenly your troops have a bit of an edge. Also, this is a thing that incentivizes alliances. Because, if you're crossing over an ally's territory, or we can even say like a client state's territory, because they're also an ally technically, you're also going to get this plus 10% melee defense. So this actually gives you another reason to get allies, which is kind of cool. Now, heroic ethos here is really the game changer here. An increased charge for all units, which is so important for a barbarian faction, because ultimately, and unsurprisingly, barbarian factions are pretty dependent on shock and awe for winning battles. They're very dependent on charging in, howling bloodthirstily as they take on their opponents in typical Hollywood-style barbarian fashion. And frankly, the Britons, of all the peoples the Romans encountered, were especially dependent on building themselves up into a frenzy and charging into battle. It's recorded over and over again, from the trials of Julius Caesar's time in Britain to the actual conquest of the Britons. Even for Boudicca's revolt, it's very well documented that the Icini kind of whipped themselves up into a battle frenzy and then charged in heroically and got absolutely slaughtered in the Battle of Watling Street. But regardless of how that ended up, this charge bonus does make sense historically, and it helps the faction a lot, because a lot of units for the Icini are a little bit weaker than other units, just statistically, but that doesn't account for this charge bonus plus, which in general I think is like a +2 to charge bonus, which in Divide et Impera +2 is pretty significant. That's probably like plus 10% on average. Even more for some units. Maybe like plus 15% for a lot of units. So in general, this charge bonus really helps out and makes the Icini feel a little bit unique. Because in general, you're going to be a little bit more dependent on shock tactics, on rapid strikes in a battle. So just in general, this is really strong, really helpful, really useful. Love this buff. Now, increased morale and experience for chariots, which is an Icini exclusive buff, is okay. The increased experience makes more of a difference, because experience chevrons just increase your stats so much in Divide et Impera. But increased morale is good too. And in general, chariots do struggle with morale, especially the more light barbarian chariots. I find that they're quite easy to rout usually. So this helps them become a little bit stronger, but ultimately you're not going to have chariots in every battle. They are quite expensive to upkeep, especially like the noble chariots, which are actually the good chariots, the only ones worth bringing in my opinion. They can cost like 500 per turn to upkeep. So you're not going to bring them in every army, considering that they're the price of an elephant to maintain. So ultimately, this might not have the most impact on you, but it's still a useful thing. Increased agricultural income, which is your other buff, is just generally a good thing. Just generally a great quality of life thing. You're always going to have a lot of agricultural income in every Dividends Impera campaign, considering that you are forced to make agricultural buildings to sustain your empire. So just having this in general will help you out. It's just a great thing. And then your debuff really isn't that important. The public order penalty from foreign cultures, it's whatever. I mean, especially because your first two provinces, Britannia and Caledonia and Hibernia are entirely Britannic. Sure, maybe a little bit of Germanic or Gallic culture might get over there somehow, just because of your proximity to the continent. However, it's going to be like 95% Britannic no matter what. So this penalty from foreign cultures doesn't really matter until you get from, to the mainland. And even then, you can spend so much time conquering and deliberately consolidating. You don't have to be rushed as long as you don't, attack some sort of alliance structure. You can be very methodical about your conquests and build the right temples, the right public order buildings. So you should be able to more or less cope with this debuff quite easily. Making the buffs is generally great, like, plus 10% melee defense, increased charge, increased morale and experience their chariots, plus some extra agricultural income. Just have some really strong military buffs and a good economic buff and a debuff that's really easy to avoid. So ultimately, the buffs just totally work out for the Icini. But that's all I really have to say when it comes to this segment. Now let's go look at the roster for the Icini, because they honestly have a really, really cool roster. And just looking at the roster has enticed me to want to try an Icini campaign. So I hope I can explain why, because the Icini are unlike any of the other Celtic factions I've covered, and it should become quite apparent why. So when it comes to the Icini roster, you really get a unique feel, primarily because, one, they're extremely focused on foot skirmishers. The vast majority of barbarian factions focus on their melee infantry and their spear infantry. That's going to be the backbone of their army. That's going to be why they win battles. But because the best of the Icini troops are factional mercenaries, meaning that, sure, you can recruit them anywhere, and you get access to these troops long before most factions get. It allows you to completely storm and overwhelm Britain. But it also means that you can't reliably recruit these guys. You might have one army that has plenty of these two melee infantry units, but then many armies where you can only recruit these other units that are available, which aren't nearly as good. Which, honestly, these other units, while somewhat pesky, some of them are kind of cost-effective but not good. Some of them are useful in certain situations, but in most not. A lot of these units are quite niche, making your missile infantry play a really important role of trying to support a somewhat unwieldy army otherwise. Your cavalry is also far better than most Celtic cavalry contingents are, making the supportive units of the Icini take unprecedented importance compared to, say, the Arverni, the Galatian, stuff like that. You have to be a lot more tactical with the Icini and a lot more strategic in the way that you build up your armies. Simultaneously, you can play many different playstyles with the Icini, which is fun. When you're going for a whole campaign, it's really boring if you can only make one type of army effectively with a faction. But with the Icini, you can go for a phalanx corps with supportive troops on the flanks. You can go for a rapid pace kind of axe and heavy sword corps. You can go more skirmish focused if you like. You can play so many different styles as the Icini, but it really is just the fact that you're only going to have a couple of these heavy units in your army that makes the Icini truly unique. It means you're going to have to be a lot more scrappy, a lot more tactical. But in any case, as we always do, let's start out with the general units that the Icini have. Your first option is this Britannic Noble Spearman, which is a decent barbarian phalanx. Now, I've been a little bit outspoken against this genre of unit just because I don't think barbarian phalanxes are amazing, and that comes from their shield wall formation. You know, ultimately, phalanxes, like hoplite phalanxes, they have a much stronger formation attack than the barbarian phalanxes, because the hoplite phalanx can actually move while in formation, while the barbarian phalanx, while it can move, like it won't kind of like push forward if you click. Like they kind of like, once you get them into the shield wall, they just kind of stay there as the shield wall. While with a phalanx, you can actually issue attack orders and the whole entire block will like push forward together, killing a lot of people and of course helping your lines remain a lot more dynamic. These guys kind of just stay put, take enemy blows, inflict whatever they can back, but they're more or less a stationary unit, making them, how do I put this, is really rigid, just really rigid, a little bit hard to use in battle. The good thing about these guys though is that they do have far better melee stats than most hoplites do, making this shield wall not as important. Like you can just straight up take them out of shield wall and just put them in as regular infantry. But at the same time, this isn't the best of barbarian phalanxes. Like say if you look at the late game phalanxes of the Arverni, they are better. You can see here 9, 20, 21, 26. Like just across the board, this unit's better, especially in armor. Like this unit only has 30 armor, the Arverni one has 38. Similarly, if you go to the Score DC Pike Phalanx, this unit is way better. Just take my word for it, they'll absolutely maul the Icini phalanx. Now there are weaker phalanxes, like for example, this Galatian one is worse. It has worse armor, albeit the same exact fighting stats. The Bowie one is way worse. This one sucks, horrible. So like ultimately this one's kind of middle of the road, but it's also not especially good. Now at the same time, I would never suggest that you actually bring like a phalanx general as a barbarian. One, because this unit's very slow and bulky, like only 2 speed means that your generals is going to be awfully slow. But at the same time, like phalanxes do have a tendency of just kind of getting bogged down and encircled and destroyed. You know, like they are a pretty rigid unit, which against barbarians, which will have a lot of quick moving infantry, like it's just really easy for these guys to get outmaneuvered and flanked. Which, you know, phalanxes when they're flanked just don't do particularly well. So I just don't feel like this is a viable unit to bring as your general, but bringing like a main line of these infantry might be good. But also, this unit is only recruitable from your 3rd tier infantry barracks, so you're gonna have to wait a little bit of time to have these guys as your like main infantry line. They also come from your 1st population class, so you just have to consider whether you want to spend a 1st population on a phalanx. You know, you can quite easily get away without spending 1st population on your infantry corps, or rather use them on better units like these two if they're available as mercenaries, or even like this spear unit. I feel like it might have more utility depending on which army you're building. I'll go over that later why, but ultimately this noble spearman, it's a choice. This really is a choice, and if you bring these guys, it will slow your army down in general, and you're kind of gonna have to make your strategy around a central phalanx. So you know, you can bring them, but it's going to dictate your fighting style. Because once you have like 5 of these or 4 of these, ultimately, like you kind of have to make your game plan around protecting them and supporting them. Moving on to your next unit, you have the Britannic Noble Swordsman. And this unit is as good as virtually any other Celtic sword, which means that they're very good. Like Celtic swords are as good as Romans. They are a little bit less defensive, but more offensive with a better charge bonus, higher weapon damage, but less melee attack and less armor in general. Now, this isn't the best Celtic noble sword ever, but they're as good as the late Bowie swordsman. They are as good, actually better, than the Galatian chosen swords because they have a javelin volley, while the Galatians don't. Just in general, this is like a solid unit. They're as good as the Nervii ones, I believe. Not the general one, which is just like better, but the regular late Belgae chosen swordsman. So in general, this unit is almost as good as any Celtic swordsman. Only the Galatian ones in Arverni outperform them, but the majority of Celtic factions, such as the Boii, the early game Galatians, we've showcased the Nervii will be working with a sword unit just like this. And I just make that out because, don't forget, the Iberian factions, they didn't really have a unit that was similar to the Celts in this regard, especially from early game, and other British factions actually won't. So the Icini are unique in having a unit that's just as competitive as the other Celtic heavy swords. Now, this unit is available as a factional mercenary, which I think we've kind of started talking about that with the introduction and the campaign, the in-campaign part of this guide, but I kind of want to reiterate here that when a unit is a factional mercenary, you're at most going to be able to recruit one additional of these unit per turn, and you're not going to get a new one of these every turn. Like every couple of turns are going to come in. So you're never really going to have like a full line of these guys unless you've been extremely deliberate about just putting them all in one army, or maybe like your early game army is going to have quite a few of these just because you're going to be fully focused on building up an army. But going into late game, you're going to be less and less capable of making armies that are heavy with these guys. Meaning that you are going to have to look elsewhere for your main line going into late game, which is unfortunate because all of these other Gallic factions, they can just straight up spam this type of unit, which is honestly what I'd recommend if you're trying to make the most competitive army. But for the Icini, that's not an option. But when it comes to the general, you can of course always recruit this guy, and I'd honestly say it's a pretty good option. It's an elite Gallic swordsman, which is as good as any sword in the game, better than most, you know, completely capable of hanging at the top. This is an absolute top tier sword unit in Divide et Impera. The only question is whether you do want to have an infantry general, because your cavalry option is also pretty viable, and at the end of the day, a cavalry option does help your generals survive. If I'm going to be completely honest, I probably wouldn't bring this general in late game, just because you're going to see a lot of equivalently strong infantry on the field most likely, and it just bringing like an infantry general in late game when they're going to be confronted by really good units, it's just a risk. I feel like it's just better to have a cavalry general that you can kind of keep out of trouble. But for early game, having an additional elite tier infantry option is just so much more important than having cavalry, because every elite unit you bring is just going to help swing the balance of the infantry fight so much compared to cavalry that I'd probably bring these guys for sure. So that's kind of how I would make my decision, but at any point you can bring this general. It's just a solid general unit. I would bring it 100% over to Phalanx. Like, I would never bring this Britannic Noble Spearman unless you're just trying to be cheeky or something, or save money. Or maybe if you're just making a defensive army, because at the end of the day, if you're trying to defend like a minor settlement against an approaching enemy, and you feel like if you just beef up the garrison a little bit, you can hold them off, then maybe bring this Noble Spearman, because you can park him in a choke point, put on the shield wall, and go to work. But this Noble Sword is just better. It's just a better unit. I'd bring them over. This Britannic Heavy Cavalry is also a pretty good option, though. But of course, it's a little bit of a weird genre of cavalry. In fact, I've never really fully liked the genre of cavalry, because these guys aren't really like fully cavalry in my opinion. They're more like mounted infantry, and the reason why is because they just go in fighting with swords, and their main statistical prowess, like their main good thing statistically, like their main asset is that these guys have really high weapon damage, meaning that they do really well at prolonged combat. But amongst cavalry units, these guys have a really bad charge. Like, they can still do a hammer and anvil, don't get me wrong, but compared to other cavalry, particularly elite cavalry, they have a really bad charge at 40. They do have good combat stats, with 14 melee defense and 13 melee attack, but this charge bonus more or less ensures that this cavalry unit is mostly effective in a prolonged fight. Yet simultaneously, these guys have swords, while most cavalry units, with the exception of cataphracts, will come in with a shield and a spear. Meaning that these guys actually aren't great against cavalry. Like, if you have a spear, that spear gives your unit a bonus versus cavalry. This stat. If you have a sword, you get a bonus versus infantry. Meaning that these guys aren't effective in a prolonged combat against cavalry specifically, but they're specifically good in prolonged combat against infantry. I hope I explained that well. right? The high weapon damage and low charge will ensure that this unit's mostly effective in prolonged melee, but the lack of bonus versus cavalry will ensure that they're actually just effective against infantry because they have a bonus versus infantry, not cavalry. Now, I'm not saying that this unit can't kill cavalry, okay? They absolutely can. They will lose against elite cavalry if it's a head-on charge between the two because your charge bonus is just bad and the momentum will carry this unit away. But especially like if this unit gets a charge and the enemy does it, you can kill almost all cavalry with this guy. Like it will win a lot of fights. Don't get me wrong. I'm just kind of talking about like a head-on engagement, okay? Like in a head-on engagement, this guy's mostly to go useful against infantry. But that's not really a super useful asset in my opinion. Like, obviously spear infantry will have a massive bonus versus cavalry, so they'll beat these guys out unless you're just like a levy tier unit. At the same time, like a heavy infantry will be able to beat these guys too, because these guys just don't have the most manpower, right, at only 75. And heavy infantry is good at withstanding a cavalry charge as long as it's not in the rear. So ultimately, this unit becomes more or less a specialist at killing like light infantry, which is such a weird purpose. They remind me of the Aspis Companion Cavalry in Vanilla, which again, it's like a cool unit, but at the same time, you don't really get a whole lot of use to them because almost anything can kill like light infantry anyway. Almost any cavalry can assist with that, particularly when it comes to flank charges. So I just don't feel like this particular kind of unit is super useful, but at the same time, you know, you can easily find use for it, particularly because this is like a great example of this unit. Like usually when a barbarian faction has this style of unit, it's not nearly as good. Either its combat stats are a little bit worse, or usually the armor is much worse. Like the Galatians have a noble general like this too, your Galatian noble cavalry, and let's see. I mean, you can see over here that its combat stats are weaker. It has 2 less melee defense and 3 less armor. So the Galatian is definitely worse in this unit too. And this unit is cheaper, although the Galatian has higher morale. But, you know, this unit is better than the Galatian version. It's better than the Syracusan version of this type of unit, which I was looking at before I started filming this guide. Actually, it's not better than the Galatian, than the Syracusan version. It's not better. 38 armor, better morale, has 1 ammunition. The Syracusan version is actually better. You see what I mean? You see what I mean? This unit is not like a great top tier cavalry unit, but it's still a decent cavalry unit. Like you could take it into battle. It'll serve you well. I would say that this noble swordsman is more competitive just in the grand scheme of things, but at the end of the day, you won't regret bringing this cavalry unit heavily. Just understand its limitations. Don't get them charged head on by like shock cavalry, or else you're in for a rude awakening and you will discover the limitations of his unit very quickly. Now moving on to the melee infantry, you're going to start out with these Icini assault infantry. And ultimately, this is the low end of your infantry offerings. I think you unlock them of like a level 1 infantry barrack. And just in general, this unit is fodder. They only have 1 armor. We do have decent morale at 42 for such a low tier unit. That's not bad. And of course, you know, this type of kind of low tier axe unit is pretty easy to make cost effective. All you need to do is just charge the enemy in the rear of this unit, and then you can inflict a lot of damage, like particularly onto elite units. These guys can immediately pay for themselves of 1 charge in the rear. They have 1 ammunition, they have 26 charge bonus, 13 armor penetration. Of course, they do suffer with 1 armor only and 9 melee defense. Like, particularly if this unit gets charged by anything competent, they will get eviscerated. And that's kind of the nature of this type of low tier axe unit. They either kill a decent amount or they die without doing anything. It's typically the 2 ways that this goes. But ultimately, this type of unit can be cost effective, so just a useful unit to have in your low tiers. So I approve of this. It's just obviously just a little nice thing to have, but this isn't something that's going to help you win your campaign all that much. It's just a nice little tool. They do have guerrilla deployment, so that's something to note, but when only a couple of your units have guerrilla deployment, I just don't find it to be the most effective function, especially a unit like this, because if you're isolated and discovered and focused upon, they'll rout so quickly because of their poor defensibility. So I feel like this unit is best on the flanks. You can maybe take 1 or 2 of them in a good army, maybe 4 if you're trying to save money, or 6 if you're really trying to save money and just building up a questionable army of levies. But That's kind of how you'd use this unit. Your Britannic Retainer Swordsmen come with your tier 2 infantry barrack. And truthfully, this unit is okay, but not great. You know, 11 melee attack, 9 melee defense, that's decent, but not amazing. 18 charge bonus, that's as much as like Roman legionaries have. So it's enough to get it done. But, you know, a more premium swordsman like your noble sword would have 21 charge bonus. But of course, this unit does benefit from your factional bonus of having like +2 charge bonus to all units. So this guy will have 20, which is ultimately pretty good. 26 weapon damage is great. That's about as much as legionaries have. You know, an elite Celtic sword would have either 28 or 30. So this unit is decidedly of a lower tier because of its 26, but simultaneously, it's better than a lot of cheaper barbarian swords that only have 23. These guys only have 15 armor, which is a weakness, but 15 armor is kind of like that sweet spot when it's not terrible, but it's not great either. It's just very kind of lower, you know, it's either lower mid-tier or like high levy tier. That's kind of where I'd place it. But because these guys have better charge than average, plus 225 men, you can forgive this. Just understand that these guys will die quite quickly, and they also don't have particularly great shields with only 6, so these guys can be kind of susceptible to dying from missile fire if your enemies focus upon these guys. 45 base morale is acceptable for a unit of this caliber, and it's nice that they still have 3 speed and a volley of javelins, making them, you know, a little bit more flexible that way. You know, they're faster, they can shoot a volley of javelins before going in. It's really good to have javelins. This is overall a solid lower tier swordsman. Not the best lower tier swordsman you're gonna get amongst all the barbarian factions, but a very solid one, definitely a usable one. Once you unlock this unit, you're going to make plenty of armies out of these guys, particularly because you can't recruit your better units en masse. Now, these guys do come from your second population class, which is kind of like the one weakness these guys have, because for a second population unit, these guys aren't amazing. If it came from your third population class, I definitely praise them more, but this unit is just like okay, like a perfectly acceptable. Against armies full of elite tier units, they will falter, but against armies of levy tier, they will slaughter. They are kind of that like solid in the middle type unit, and you could definitely use them. They're also very cheap to maintain on the campaign map, so while it might be a little bit hard to get the populations necessary to recruit them, at the very least they are very cheap to maintain. Now, these Britannic Swordmasters are incredibly strong. In fact, I would just straight up say that they are probably overpowered. It is a straight up amazing unit. Like, they are comparable to late game Thracian infantry. In fact, I think it's a very valid comparison. They have the same charge bonus, weapon damage, melee, armor penetration. The only difference is that this unit's available like turn 120 or whatever. This unit's available like turn 2 because you very quickly start getting them as factional mercenaries. Whenever you see these guys available, recruit them. Again, they're from your mercenary menu. They're just amazing. And the one thing that this unit has, which makes it truly amazing, is that despite having a massive 36 charge bonus, effectively enough armor penetration to ignore armor, just armor is irrelevant. If these guys see armor, they just kill it. 3 speed, so they're still maneuverable. Great armor, great morale. Like, just overall, the only weakness of this unit is that, like, one, you know, if they get bogged down in combat and start getting charged without getting recharged, they can die. And of course, they're not very defensible. Like all two-handed wielding infantry units, you know, they do well in a charge, they falter afterwards, you want to pull them in and out, keep on getting those charges off. And of course, they're pretty weak to missile fire because they don't have a shield, so hold them back until you've dealt with the enemy skirmishers or at least occupied them before you kind of swing these guys in, or else they can get shot a couple of times and lose their combat effectiveness because of that. But the one thing that makes these guys super overpowered is that they have the scare ability, meaning that they lower enemy morale, and they actually do so a lot. So not only will they charge in and just effectively start killing things really quickly, because that's what this type of armor penetration and charge bonus does, but they further lower the morale with scare, and just charging these guys frontally into anything, they'll just kill it. Like, other than like Thracian nobles, you know, like equivalent style units. They will absolutely kill it. This is one of the best two-handed wielding units in the game just because of the scare, as well as maintaining the elite combat stats that others will have. It's by far the most accessible elite two-handed wielding unit just because you can get them so quickly. And because of that, these guys are just amazing in the Icini roster. By far your best infantry unit. You know, it just sucks that you can't spam them. It just sucks that you can't bring a ton of them. But that also adds to the charm. It adds to the difficulty. If you could just bring a bunch of these, like, come turn 30, if you just make, like, the correct infantry barrack, this campaign would be super easy. Just bring a bunch of these, you win every battle. Like, against a dumb AI, at least. But considering that you're only going to have 1 or 2 of these in each army at the most because of constraints that factional mercenaries bring upon you, it's going to make things a lot more difficult. And you're going to have to rely upon, again, like acceptably good but not amazing swordsmen, and of course your skirmishers and cavalry to bail you out. But these guys are absolutely amazing. Get them on the flanks, probably best on the flanks, to be honest, because that scare ability will just help them wrap up the enemy. Like once you hit like the furthermost enemy infantry on the side, it's just game over. And once these guys start charging the enemy flanks, it is totally game over. That scare, as well as the charge damage and the armor penetration, will just have them take off. You can charge these guys frontally into Roman legionaries. They'll just cleave them to pieces. This is an absolutely amazing, overpowered unit. A++, bring them if you can. This unit sucks though. Late Britannic heavy swordsmen are by far the most underwhelming late-game barbarian infantry available in Divideat and Impera. They're just truly mediocre. Zero impact from these guys, zero charisma, absolute crap units, and we'll compare them to what I typically compare crappy late-game infantry to, which are Thorax swordsmen. Let's go pull out a standard Thorax swordsman, not the Fenians. They have the mercenary variant, which I believe are slightly different, but let's see. Pergamon has a different unit. Ptolemies, I think I have regular Thorax swordsmen. Yeah, Ptolemaic Thorax swordsmen. These guys are about as common as they come. But you'll notice here that these stats are identical to these stats. Well, almost. This unit has 10 melee defense. This unit has 11 melee defense. I mean, the same weapon damage, the same charge bonus, same armor penetration. Whenever your late game infantry unit is comparable to Thorax swords, you know that you don't have a particularly great infantry unit on your hands. And this is not a particularly great infantry unit, but it's from a culture that usually produces really good infantry units. Like, you'd expect a, you know, Celtic faction to have a great late game heavy sword, but this unit's terrible. You know, the only silver lining is that, of course, it still benefits from the factional +2 charge bonus. So I guess it'll have 18 charge bonus, which is slightly less underwhelming, but at the same time, you know, this unit's only 150 men, and it has 23 weapon damage, which is paltry, which is pathetic, which means that these guys just won't kill particularly effectively, even compared to these Britannic retainer swordsmen. Like, to be honest with you, because of the higher charge bonus and the higher weapon damage, I would suggest that you bring these guys over these guys. Like, yes, these guys do have a whopping 20 more armor, the late Britannic heavy swordsmen, but they're also much more expensive in your Britannic retainers. They also come with less men. The Britannic retainers come with 225. These guys come with 150. And those 75 additional men will probably just make these guys just as combat effective as the late Britannic heavy swordsmen, while simultaneously being significantly cheaper. These light swordsmen are also quicker and almost have the same morale. It just truly, I think the light swordsmen are so much better bang for buck that I would just never recommend you bring the heavy swordsmen. You can try them out in your campaign, but I just believe will disappoint you, and I think these guys are just a black hole in the Britannic rosters in general, but Icini in particular, because again, you're looking for that stable unit, since these elite units you won't bring as often. And right now, it's falling on your Britannic retainer swordsmen, which are just good, but compared to the other Celtic factions, these guys will be absolutely eviscerated in late game. Like, you know, there's going to be way better units on the field, so we need something to help bail them out. One of those units could be the Britannic noble swordsmen. Like I mentioned, they're just as good as the elite swordsmen of any Celtic faction, meaning that they're great. They just, at the end of the day, they are factional mercenaries, so, you know, don't expect to have a ton of these in your army. You know, if you can get like 4 units between these Britannic Noble Swords and between these Sword Masters in an army, that's about as much as you can kind of expect, and it'll be good, but you're gonna have to fill out the ranks with these swordsmen, probably bringing like an equivalent number of these retainer swords, which will just in generally weaken your melee infantry. The only real saving grace here is that you do have some pretty cost-effective units with these Britannic retainer swordsmen, which, I mean, these guys are just really good, like, considering the price that you pay for them. And of course, these Icini assault infantry also offer some decent saving potential. These sword masters are really, really good, though. Like, these guys really help redeem the roster, and as long as you can bring a couple of these, you can kind of win any battle in theory. But because you won't be able to spam the nobles and the swords, you're going to have a slightly scrappier line, which is also going to be aided by your spearmen. And in all honesty, you have some decent spear options. The first of which is your Britannic Levy, which admittedly is not very solid. This is just a crappy Levy spear. 14 melee defense is pretty good for a unit of this caliber, but ultimately everything else is basically at default levels. You know, I guess because every single unit has superior charge, the 16 will be buffed up to 18, which is kind of good actually, but just overall this Levy Spearman is unexceptional and will die and flee pretty quickly. Can't rely on them, but this Britannic Retainer Spearman is actually going to be pretty useful, and that's because these guys are going to be akin to a Freyo Spear. They come from your second class. They're very, very cheap. They come with your second, what is it, your second Infantry Barrack 2, so they're quite accessible. You can probably like recruit them like 10 turns in. And for just as good as a Freyo Spear, -5 armor. You know, they have 15 armor, rather than the 20. But they do get that factional +2 charge bonus. So I feel like that kind of equals out. Like, this one is just a more offensive Freyo Spear, and that's just good. Like, it's not like Freyo Spears are going to carry you into the late game, especially against your barbarian neighbors who are going to have great melee infantry. But Freyo Spears are always a great supportive element. You have like 2 or 4 of these guys on the flanks, and you can just, in general, stabilize things quite a bit. I would prefer your swordsman as your main core, but I can always just imagine having a couple of these on the flanks, just because these guys will help ward off enemy cavalry, and will just kind of be a more stable and defensive presence on your flanks, and you don't want your flanks breaking, so, you know, I prefer these guys on the flanks over your swordsman, but I prefer the swordsman as your main line. That's kind of how I would take it. Now, this Britannic Guard Spearman is kind of a weird unit, because it doesn't come from your infantry barracks, nor does it come from your town hall buildings. It actually comes from your temple buildings, as well as some of your economic buildings that you make in your town center. This unit is just really, really good. Like, it comes with some cool abilities like Encourage, so it actually helps increase the morale of the units around your general, kind of like a druid unit would in like the base game, or like your general would. But just in general, this unit is really good. It's a shock spear. It has 14 melee attack and 14 melee defense, which are great stats. 29 charge bonus, which is amazing for a spear. The main negative of them is that it has only 25 weapon damage, which is like, the weapon damage for spears are just generally lesser than that of swords, which is why swords kill better in combat, but the spears are more versatile since they have like anti-cavalry capabilities too. But just in general, this unit is great. Like, it's going to boost the morale of your men. It charges in really, really hard. It has 30 armor, great morale, so it's stable. Only weakness is that it only has 2 speed, so they're a little bit cumbersome and no javelin. But just overall, though, these guys are really, really solid. And considering that your swordsmen are more of like a middle tier type unit, you know, only 45 morale, only 15 armor, it makes sense to bring like 2 of these guys to kind of stabilize the rest of your swordsmen. Like, if you have like, you know, 5 swordsmen, maybe like 2 of these guys, like 1 of these, just, you know, I'm kind of going off of what's possible. Cavalry general, you know, this is kind of the infantry corps that you would gun for in an Icini army, in my opinion. Your other option is your late Britannic heavy spearman, which is okay-ish. Up to your second tier population, while this Britannic Guard Spearman comes from your first tier population, so, you know, that's kind of a reason to bring this unit over this unit, but otherwise there's no reason to, because this is just such a lackluster unit. Only 24 weapon damage ensures that they're not going to be very offensively capable. 19 charge bonus isn't great. This unit has lesser stats than that of a typical 4x spear, which is, in general, a red flag, because, like, I don't know, man, like, 4x spearmen aren't exactly the top echelon of, you know, infantry, especially when compared to that of barbarian factions, which tend to have far better melee and spear infantry than out of the Greeks, other than phalanxes, of course. So ultimately, this unit is just lackluster, but it is stable. You know, 35 armor, 19 melee defense. These guys will hold their ground for just a nice defensive presence, but not a offensively capable unit, not in a great way anyway. Your one phalanx, we've already covered them. This is a decent, viable phalanx unit. Ultimately, though, their first tier population is shared between your noble cavalry unit, this phalanx, your factional mercenaries as well. So at the end of the day, I don't really advise that you waste a ton of first class population just recruiting this phalanx, because I just feel like it's not a good use of it. I think everything else straight up that I mentioned, from these two swordsmen to this Britannic Guard spearman, is just so much more useful. Because these Britannic Guards, you just put a couple behind your men, they ward off enemy cavalry, they can use their charge bonus to be a really effective like flanking unit. You can just throw them into combat and they'll still be a reasonably strong defensive unit and mainline fighter, and will just encourage everything. Like, these guys are just so much better than having like a full line of these phalanxes, which are just going to keep your army a lot more rigid and tactically inflexible. So I personally wouldn't go for the phalanx, but if you want a nice defensive line that can hold out, these guys are an option, and they are viable enough. But now, like, moving on to your missile infantry, you know, your missile infantry is just absolutely crazy. Like, every single one of these units is effective in its own way and has its own purpose. And while you might not have like the best skirmishers or archers, you definitely have the best slingers. And your archers and skirmishers are very good as well. So just in general, you have some absolutely excellent options. Just the problem is that 3 of them only become available in late game. And I think this is maybe now a good time to mention what the unique reforms of the Britons are. Like, to get the reforms that the British faction has, you need to possess all of the British Isles, which is pretty easy. Like I mentioned, you can conquer all of Britannia by turn 10, and I don't think Caledonia is going to give you a ton of challenge. But not only do you need to possess the entirety of the British Isles, but you also have to wait to turn 110, which is late, but not the latest. I mean, after all, the Roman imperial reforms are later, the Parthian imperial reforms are later, the Forax reforms are later. You know, 110 is reasonable enough. So you're going to have to wait for turn 110 to get access to these archers, to get access to your late game cavalry, to get access to these 2 infantry options, which, to be fair, are not very good. Like, especially with late Britannic heavy swordsmen, you might as well not care that you're going to get these guys. Your spearmen a little bit more, but at the end of the day, if you can get the Britannic Guard spearmen, they're better than these in my opinion, so who cares about getting these? And your Britannic retainer spearmen are perfectly viable. You don't really need this late Britannic heavy spearmen, but the loss of your elite skirmish corps until then is really a significant blow to this faction. And it's one of the reasons why I would caution against calling this the best skirmish faction in the game, but I would definitely put them up there. Like, I would absolutely, unhesitantly say that Icini are amongst the S tier of skirmish factions, and we'll go over why. Now, you start out with your Britannic skirmisher, and this unit is just generally very cost-effective. It's not like an elite skirmisher, obviously not, but they're just really, really cost-effective. You know, they have 21 missile damage, 85 range, which is, you know, better than some skirmishers. At the same time, these guys have 8 ammunition, which is better than a lot of skirmishers. A lot of skirmishers, especially the cheap ones, come with only 6 shots. So to have 8 shots makes this unit better than average. Combine that with actual decent combat effectiveness, because this unit has 24 charge bonus and 12 armor penetration, which this is like the characteristic stat line of a cheap axe unit. So this unit, not only will they throw 8 reasonable javelins at a good range, but they'll also be able to charge in with axes and actually be a good flanking unit. Making your money back from this unit is just a piece of cake. Like, as long as you just get them within range of your enemy, throw your javelins, and then just try to like hit the flank with a charge, these guys will be cost effective 100% of the time, making them a good skirmish unit. Your Britannic spear slingers are excellent. They have shields, which is good for a slinger. Like, you want a slinger that has a shield. That's what kind of what is it? Like, the range, the damage, and the shield. are typically what characterizes a good slinger from a bad slinger, but that's not the only thing that's going on with this unit. Not only do they have a shield, but they have 33 base morale compared to the typical 30 base morale of a cheap slinger. You have 190 range and 11 missile damage, which is what you're looking for. There's a lot of slingers that only have 165 range, which basically means that that slinger sucks. It's completely useless at that point. Because, like, what's the point? You might as well just use archers then. But this unit has the 190 range that actually makes a slinger useful. But also, this unit has a spear, and they go into combat with more or less the combat stats of a levy tier spear unit. In fact, this unit has better combat stats than this Britannic levy spearman, but, you know, similar stats to, honestly, most levy spearmen, which is good. At the end of the day, most slingers have the worst combat stats out of any unit in Divideat Impera. Generally, slingers are terrible at melee combat, except for the hybrid units that the Balearic faction offers, as well as the Rhodian light hoplites. But most slingers are terrible. Like, even looking at, like, elite slingers, like the Rhodian slingers, like, this unit can't do anything in melee. 5 melee attack, 4 melee defense, no charge, only 18 weapon damage, no armor penetration. This unit's not going to do anything in melee combat. Well, this unit actually can. Like, it's not going to be crazy in melee combat, but they can quite easily kill enemy skirmishers. They can go into cavalry that's already charged and just go in with their spears and kill them. They can quite effectively fight enemy on the flank or fight like a low tier levy unit face to face. Just in general, this unit is exceptionally versatile while also being a great skirmisher. Great unit. Recruit them throughout your campaign until you get your late game version, which is just an upgrade in every sense. Amazing unit. Your late Britannic Irish Raiders, these guys are available turn 110 as long as you've conquered Britannia, but why? How could you have not at this point? And just in general, this unit is amazing. They have elite skirmish stats, throwing 6 javelins at 90 range and doing 22 missile damage. This is also one of those skirmish units that has 150 men, which just makes them more effective in general. Like not only are we throwing more javelins, which is important, it's 19 additional javelins compared to, say, the Britannic skirmisher or any other 131 typical skirmisher unit. But then also this unit has good combat stats. It has 14 melee attack and 7 melee defense, which is akin to that of like a mid-tier unit, honestly. 23 weapon damage, 4 armor penetration, 16 charge bonus. Like, this unit's alright in a melee. You know, they're kind of like as good as, I would say, like a lower tier sword unit. In fact, these stats look familiar to me. I think they're the same as the Erevaci light swordsman. No, they're not. No, they're not. They're actually better than the Erevaci light swordsman, which I think that should be pretty indicative. But this is a good unit. This is a solid unit in a melee. The only negative of this is that it's more of one of those like stable melee fighters. Got 16 charge bonus isn't great, although +2 is going to be 18, which is actually decent. But you know, this unit doesn't do like crazy armor penetration or anything. So in general, this unit isn't going to be the most shocking unit to have hit a flank, but they totally can hang. They can totally hang after throwing a massive amount of javelins. Very, very, very good unit. I'd highly recommend them. Now moving on, you also have these elite Britannic Highland Archers, and I absolutely love this unit. For one, because they're such a luxury, because like in general, Celtic factions don't have good archers. Just across the board, with the exception of the Nervii and with the exception of the Boii, Celtic factions have horrendous archers. And even when they do have good archers, or reasonable archers, they're usually just like okay. Like this unit, you know, they're not world beating or anything like that. But this unit just in general so good for an archer. Not only do they have elite skirmishing capabilities because they have 175 range and 16 missile damage compared to the 165 range and 15 missile damage of a typical archer unit, but they have really good melee combat capabilities in exactly the way that I like it, because these guys are axemen. 28 charge bonus. 28 charge bonus on an archer. 14 armor penetration. 9 melee attack and 8 melee defense isn't even that bad. Like, this unit is more or less like a mid-tier axe unit, while also being an elite tier archer. Yes, their weakness is that they don't have shields and they only have 10 armor, meaning that if these guys get charged by anything, they're dead, just like a low-tier archer. But at the same time, if you can keep him protected and you can charge him into the rear after using their ammo, these guys can be absolute killers. So this unit kind of high risk, high reward because of the low armor, considering their cost. But also all of these skirmishers come from your third population class, by the way. So like, you know, even if they're expensive to maintain, they're not difficult to recruit. And these guys just have so much utility on the battlefield, so much like high damage potential. Like what I love about this unit is that it's totally like an X Factor unit. This is the type of unit that can win you battles single-handedly just because of its ability to output massive amounts of damage. Totally worth it, but it is hard to justify bringing these guys because they're competing against your late Britannic Slinger Spearmen, who are, in my opinion, the best Slinger unit in Divide at Impera, hands down. Not only do they have amazing range at 215, which is ludicrous, man, these guys are like snipers, but they do an impressive 13 missile damage, bringing them closer to that of archers. They shoot faster than your typical slinger, because most slingers, like, their main detriment is that they're slower than archers and do less damage, but these guys shoot as fast as archers with 6 shots per minute. But they also maintain the spearman stats of the last unit, making them still great against enemy skirmishers. They can still take on cavalry that's stationary. You know, this is just such a versatile unit, even more so than the earlier variant, solely because of more armor, as well as just, you know, obviously elite slinger stats. You know, these guys are better than Rhodians, they're better than Balearics. This is totally a great unit to have. But if you don't want to be as defensive, and ultimately slingers are kind of a defensive tool, you know, they shoot slower than archers, generally, not this unit, but generally, they don't output as much damage. You know, if you want to kind of go more offensive, I would kind of take the late Britannic Highland Archer once you unlock him. If you wanted to kind of be more defensive, more tactical, more kind of, I don't know, like you're not blitzing your opponent as much, like you're playing more drawn out battles, I would take the late Britannic Slinger for that. And then your Irish Raider, that's kind of just if you want to buff up your infantry line. Like if you find that your infantry is kind of losing against whatever opponent you're fighting, you know, bring a couple of these just to kind of buff them out, as well as just, you know, sink some javelins into your enemies just to make that initial engagement a lot worse for them. Now, when it comes to your cavalry, you don't have like the best cavalry in the game. But for a Celtic faction, and most Celtic factions don't have amazing cavalry, Icini are honestly pretty decent. They're the best cavalry, undoubtedly, amongst their Britannic cousins. But just amongst the Celts in general, they have great cavalry. And just in general, like, all of their offerings are good. They don't have any, like, solely inferior options. But at the same time, like, this is not one of the best cavalry factions in the game, but it's above average. And you're going to start out with his Britannic medium cavalry, which is great. It's unlockable at your second cavalry barrack. And this unit is just in general super solid. Like, it comes from your second population class, so they're pretty accessible. And they have like good stats, like 9 melee attack, 15 melee defense, 48 charge bonus, 26 weapon damage. That's like solid mid-tier level cavalry. You know, for nimble, they have 7 speed, which makes sense because they only have 23 armor, but 23 armor, while not fantastic by any means, is still reasonable for one, a barbarian unit, and 2, for like a second tier, you know, for a second population class, early game cavalry unit. Like, just overall, this unit's super solid, great against skirmishers, can kill enemy cavalry. This is a better cavalry unit than a lot of barbarian factions get. And this isn't even your noble option. This is just like your second tier option. Just overall, very versatile unit. Totally useful, will help support your men. Just solid. Not amazing, but solid. Your noble one we already covered, right? It's one of those kind of mounted infantry units. You know, it's effective in very specific situations against mostly light infantry, but they can fight enemy cavalry as long as they don't get, you know, a kind of a 50-50 head-on charge against something much better at charging. But overall, this unit is better than the last because, you know, this 23 armor, you cannot compare it against the bulky 38 armor of his Britannic heavy cavalry. This is your more premium option, but they're much more expensive. They come from your first population class. They come from a higher tier cavalry barrack, I believe your third tier cavalry barrack. So I'd caution against over-recruiting these guys. These guys are definitely more cost-effective, I would say, because this unit is very cheap for what they offer. But this unit is more powerful, and in general will beat the vast majority of barbarian cavalry units, I would say. You know, we're just overall a solid unit. Your late Britannic heavy cavalry are really good, though. You know, not because this is some sort of enigma of a unit, but just because it comes from your second population class, and they have, frankly, the stats that you'd expect from like a first population class unit. They have elite late game cavalry stats. The characteristic 10, 17, 50 charge bonus, 27 weapon damage. You know, again, at the beginning I was 10 melee attack, 17 melee defense, 38 armor. Like, I've seen this stat line across factions in Divide and Impera. And ultimately, this is just what you'd expect of like an elite, you know, cavalry unit that uses a spear, a short stabbing spear, and a shield. And the majority of units that have a stat line will come from your first population class. So to have these guys come from your second population class is great. This one also has a volley of like little javelins, like little darts that they throw in before they go into battle, and they have 6 speed, but this bar is filled up more than average. So they're faster than like the average 6 speed cavalry unit. So just like overall, so many pluses for this unit, and just a great versatile unit. And like, none of these units are like world beaters. Like, the Eastern factions, pretty much all of them will have cavalry that outperform these units. But none of his units are very expensive, and all of his units are good. Like, they are better than the average German or Celtic cavalry unit. You know, the Arverdi will have like better options than, say, the Icini or something. Like, there are Celtic factions that are better, like this Gallic late heavy cavalry is better than the unit I just showed you, or, you know, there's some other factions that are better, like the Editani. Where are the Editani? Where are those elusive Iberians? Like, this unit, like this faction has better cavalry, like this Iberian armored cavalry. I think it's better than anything I just mentioned, albeit this unit. You can see, like, this Iberian medium cavalry, they have like almost the same stats as this Britannic medium cavalry I showed you before. Like, just overall, like, these are solid options. Like, there's some factions that are better, but overall, like, this is better than most Celtic factions. And we haven't even gone to the chariots yet, right? Which are an extra spice on top of that. Now, your Britannic light cavalry, this is like a typical javelin cavalry that you get at the beginning of the game. Like, almost every faction has a version of this. But what makes this one unique is that it has 47 charge bonus, while the vast majority don't have like an amazing charge bonus. Simultaneously, it does have 26 weapon damage, meaning that they can do damage in a prolonged melee against the right opponent. Just overall, like, these guys will be good for taking out enemy skirmishers, but they will die in a prolonged combat against virtually any cavalry unit. Simultaneously, it doesn't have amazing javelin throwing ability, like only 85 range and 21 missile damage is pretty mediocre. So overall, like, this is better than, like, say, your typical Greek javelin throwing cavalry, you know, the really bad ones, but this is not like an amazing unit by any means. But now let's move on to your chariots. Now, the thing is that chariot units are definitely a humongous risk, particularly barbarian chariots, because they're much lighter. Like, they don't have nearly as much armor or health as like a heavy side chariot, the type that Pontus would use, the type that the Seleucids would use, the type that the Egyptians, I think, have. If I remember, actually, I don't think the Egyptians do. I think I'm wrong to say that. Do they? No, they don't. I messed up there. But anyway. You know, these guys are definitely worse, but they do come with more men, which means that they can throw more javelins effectively. You know, and ultimately these guys have a lot of javelins, actually. That's like the main asset of these guys, in my opinion, because they have 30 freaking javelins. And they do 22 missile damage. Making these guys more of a conduit to just shower the enemy with javelins than anything else, I think. My personal opinion, I think that's the main asset of these guys. Just throw in a ton of javelins and then just go in. But ultimately, these guys cause a lot of fear amongst the enemy. Like, have a scare effect. At least the noble ones do. To be fair, that's like a real reason why to get the noble ones. Like, of these two options, the noble ones, they are a factional mercenary, so they're probably easier to recruit. Like, you'll just find a place to do them compared to these Britannic chariots. And besides that, they're just so much better. Like, 10 more charge bonus, they have a scare impact while the other one doesn't. They have like double the armor. Like, in all honesty, I don't even feel like you should bring this Britannic chariot because you're so ludicrously easy to kill. Like, they will die before anything, and because like most factions that you're facing will have like long range skirmishers and stuff like that, I imagine that these guys will just get killed by skirmishers in the early game unless you keep these guys back. But noble chariots are a lot more survivable and a lot more impactful. It's just truly your decision. It's a personal decision whether you want to bring chariots or not, but your chariots will be a nice accompaniment to the other shock factors in your army, like these Britannic swordsmen, like these shock spears, like some of your skirmishers as well, and some of your lower tier infantry. Just in general, because all of your guys have better charge bonus because of that, you know, factional wide buff, I feel like these chariots kind of slot into this general like gung-ho charge style that the Icini are going to play really, really well, and will just have good synergy with the rest of your roster, which is why I'd recommend you bring them when typically I wouldn't. Also, this Britannic noble chariot just is a very beefy, very good chariot unit. Like, this is just an exceptionally good chariot unit compared to the other light chariots in the game, so I can approve of this one, but the Britannic chariot's not exactly. And that's really the whole roster. Like, in general, if you just evaluate the melee infantry and you kind of take these Britannic nobles and these Britannic swordmasters and you just limit their numbers in your head, and you look at the rest of the units and you have to flesh them out, this faction has weaker melee infantry and spears than is typical for a barbarian faction, but they definitely make up for it with far better than average missile infantry and a usable, and while not like exceptionally strong, very diverse cavalry roster. And because of that, I would say that this faction is pretty powerful, especially because this Britannic Swordmaster is just insanely good. These slingers and these archers and these Irish raiders are extremely good, and you know, cavalry is decent. You know, it's not a weakness, I can tell you that. You know, because of that, you really can't find like an extreme weakness. It's just at the same time, if you don't have a lot of your swordmasters and swordsmen, you might have to win by somewhat unconventional means, like being super effective with your skirmishers, getting some gritty wins with your cavalry, you know, being, you know, pretty smart in the way that you take engagements with your not as good swordsmen, but maybe like, you know, being crafty with these shock spears, which are kind of an unconventional tool to win your battles with. You know, chariots are definitely an unconventional tool, particularly barbarian chariots. So in general, I wouldn't say the difficulty comes from the roster being bad. I would say the difficulty comes from having to use tools you typically wouldn't to win your battles. And because of that, you know, I would say that this is a strong faction, but not a powerhouse faction. I would give them that solid faction rating, which is a 7 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. But in terms of your actual campaign, 7 out of 10 in terms of how powerful the faction is. That's what I would say. Like, they have everything that it takes to win, but simultaneously, you know, they're lacking the consistency that a powerhouse faction, you know, a 10 out of 10, a 9 out of 10 faction would have. Now, at the same time, this isn't a very difficult campaign, because your start position's very easy. You know, you can have like 2 full provinces, 7 settlements, far easier than the vast majority of factions. And you don't have to like encumber yourself in massive conflicts like, say, the Seleucids or the Egyptians do in order to attain or maintain that kind of empire. Instead, you can just safely chill in Britannia and then plan your invasion of Northern Europe on your own terms. And because of that, combined with being able to recruit your best units as factional mercenaries with ease, I'll include chariots in that too. You know, because of that, I would say this is just not a very difficult campaign. In fact, I would say that it's like a 2 out of 10 in terms of difficulty. It's a very, very simple, straightforward campaign. But at the same time, it's a unique campaign because of this factional mercenary thing. I mean, I haven't seen any other factions where your very best units are recruitable exclusively as factional mercenaries. And because of that, I would say that this campaign is in of itself just interesting. And also just in general, I was kind of charmed by this roster in general. As I flipped through it, I see so many cool things. Like these slingers are cool, these archers are really cool. You know, having to kind of use his mounted infantry style cavalry is different. You know, these type of chariots are different than the kind that you'd actually rely on with like the Eastern factions that have good chariots. And, you know, because this noble chariot is so beefy, it actually gives me an incentive to try out such a unit. So ultimately, I would just say that, like, this faction, while easy, gives you a very different experience of Rome 2. And because of that, I'd recommend them. I'd actually really recommend them. And while my whole rating on like how much you should play a campaign is completely subjective, I personally feel drawn to playing this campaign. Like, I want to now. And because of that, I would give these guys a solid 8 out of 10. I totally think you should try them. Anyone that likes, you know, Celtic style factions will absolutely adore the Icini and will have a great amount of time, great amount of fun with them. And yeah, that's really all that I have to say when it comes to the Icini. I think that they're a great faction. I think you'll enjoy playing a campaign as them, so why not give them a try, right? I mean, ultimately, sure, you don't need to, right? They're not like an essential, like a quintessential experience. But I just feel like they're a particularly well-made Celtic-style faction, so ultimately, I definitely try them out. But that's all I have to say when it comes to this guide. If you enjoyed what you heard, if you enjoyed my style of commentary, please like and subscribe. And yeah, I also did want to give like a mild channel update, because I haven't been posting particularly often as of late. And that's just been because my life has been exceptionally busy between a job, got a girlfriend, you know, just between the things that tend to consume an adult's time, my life has been quite busy. But I do want to get back into YouTubing. I do want to get back into making these videos, and of course I want to diversify my channel's content because I've been so razor focused on these guides over the last couple of months, and I do want to get back into streaming. So do anticipate the start of a MetaWii campaign that will be streamed live on this channel. Otherwise, I do want to get back into making historical videos. Not something that's going to happen every day, mind you, but, you know, I did like that type of genre. So expect more diversity in the content that you see on this channel. Expect kind of to bounce between, like, live streams, more guides, historical style videos, and just expect a higher density of uploads, because ultimately, I do want to upload more than once a week. You know, it's kind of a product of just how much free time I have nowadays, rather than what I personally feel is like how much YouTube I want to do, how much time I want to put into this hobby. So do expect more, but that's all I have to say for now. You know, stay tuned, expect the rest of the British factions to get their own guides, and yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.